Um, wow, you're on, as they say.
Yay. All right. Thank you, Bruce. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to do this. I am going to read from a paper that I recently wrote. Let me just give a little background to it. I've been working on Cornell for a while, less on the films than in sort of working in the archives at the Smithsonian and studying what I think of as being his relation to film and the connection between the boxes and the film. I really appreciated Bruce's comment in the beginning that the films are not sentimental and charming necessarily. I think Rose Hobart tends to be, but I always find the films to be difficult and actually challenging. And I've always struggled with what I thought I would say about them. And I hadn't said anything until I was asked about a year ago to write an essay about an avant-garde film and the traveler's gaze. And I immediately thought of Bookstalls. So I started to study it and wrote this paper, and I'm going to read it as quickly as I can. I appreciate that people might wander in the meantime, but I will work through it. All right, so it's called Time Traveling in Cornell's Bookstalls. It would not be an error to say that the films of Joseph Cornell are both renowned and little known. Historians of the avant-garde and students of film, especially those interested in found footage film, know Rose Hobart and at least know of the approximately 30 other films and fragments that he completed before he died in 1972. Of course, most people familiar with 20th century American art are aware of Cornell's work in his principal medium, the glass-fronted or open boxes containing haunting bits of ephemera found in museums around the world. In this essay, I move beyond the renowned Cornell work to bring attention to his more marginal practice as an avant-garde filmmaker who found 16-millimeter film perfectly suited to his ideas about the material world and time. My exploration will consider an even lesser-known aspect of Cornell's life and thought, his profound commitment to Christian Science, a religion that asserts the reality of spirit over mortal mind and matter. Cornell was an extraordinary traveler who wandered not only across the globe with a preference for France, but throughout the galaxy, all without leaving New York City. His itinerary consisted of bookstalls and flea markets where he encountered photographed and filmed images depicting fragments of lives lived in other times and places, which he then assembled into films that were both travelogues and dreamscapes. In response to the reductive characterization of Cornell as, quote, a nostalgist, a recluse, or a naif, end quote, one of Cornell's finest critics, P. Adams Sidney, describes Cornell as a, quote, dialectician of experience, end quote. Sidney posits that the often sentimental objects and images in the work are just raw material in complex and even ironic montage constructions. The raw material of the films in particular is usually an amalgamation of banal images that are often taken from educational travel films, which become mysterious through juxtaposition. While the images expose the world, they challenge our ability to create stories about it. The heavily edited films combine space and time in ways that contest how we know anything of the world. Undoubtedly, Cornell's most pertinent film in regard to representations of travel and the tourist gaze is Bookstalls, a 10-minute found footage film made in the late 1930s. While there is no evidence that Cornell ever engaged in an anti-colonialist critique, the film embodies a universalizing sensibility that highlights the cinema's role in the creation of the hegemonic master narratives that were under consideration in the journal in which this paper is published, Papers in Language and Literature. Bookstalls begins with 4 extreme long shots of Paris taken from high above the city, 3 from somewhere on the Eiffel Tower, sections of which provide a sort of scrim indicating the presence of a 20th century modern gaze that is both literal and conceptual. The images are of such poor quality that it takes a moment to ascertain that they represent Paris rather than being almost abstract arrangements of darkness and light. Each of the approximately 10-second long action-free shots seems to shift in the projector's gate so that the viewer's attention turns from searching for content in the image to watching the dance of the scratches on the surface of the film itself. This perceptual experience is remarkably congruent with Christian Science writer Tim Armstrong's description of one of the central tenets of the religion, that it, quote, does not so much abolish the object as replace it with something different, a transfigured reality, end quote. The nature of this short section of Bookstalls exemplifies Cornell's interest in the materiality of film and the formal properties of juxtaposition that lie at the heart of his fascination with and use of found footage. Despite their deterioration, the old shots of Paris remind the viewer that the most obvious attribute of film is its ability to make the absent present. What was filmed comes alive in front of our eyes when projected. At the same time, it is immediately apparent here that few things are more ephemeral than film, which is literally nothing but light in the absence of light, regardless of the real that it so powerfully suggests. The viewer of the opening of Bookstalls is torn between the sense of reality derived from the photographic base of the medium, which exposes indexical evidence of something that existed at a specific time in the past and is no more, and the surface of the image. Paris in all its excess has, in André Bazin's terms, imprinted itself on the celluloid to come alive before our eyes in projection, despite the scratches and blurring on this fragile bit of plastic covered with an emulsion that has been disappearing little by little with each projection. Yet in the end, the question of reality is made moot by the montage process, which links images of the world to create spaces and times that are entirely imaginary. The logic of Bookstalls and its complex effects are grounded in this materiality, combined with the origins of the film footage. A decade after the film was made, Cornell wrote to film historian Claude Serban that he loved silent filmmaker Ferdinand Zecke for, quote, leaving a record Atget-like of so many of the Parisian fin de siècle landmarks, the unpretentious ones like the boutique of a charcutier, end quote. Like the early 20th century photographer Eugene Atget, Cornell salvaged the banal stuff of the world that he encountered in moments of epiphany during a lifetime of wandering through Manhattan, feeling that each object contained the experience of its discovery. While the ephemera that he placed in the famous boxes were photograph-like in capturing an experiential moment, the films additionally give the impression of being in the flow of time, paradoxically present and yet gone. In a similar vein, Cornell reflected on the effect that Agnes Varda's 1962 film, Cleo from 5 to 7, had on him, evoking a, quote, overpowering nostalgia, a real mystique for Paris, of being right there, end quote. In Cleo from 5 to 7, he experienced a cosmic o'ertaking of time, as he put it, a phrase that suggests the sensation of time travel and spatial dislocation that were essential to his project. It is the fascination with film's formal properties that propels Bookstalls forward. Following the opening section and a fifth extreme long shot of a large studio complex in Hollywood shot from a teetering airplane, a man strolls beside the Bookstalls in Paris, identified by the soaring towers of Notre Dame in the background. The clothing in particular marks the footage as past. As he exits left, the panning camera stops to look over the shoulder of a young boy wearing a jaunty cap who gazes into an open book before closing it and returning it to a shelf. In a scarcely perceptible dissolve to a mere fragment of film, the boy is again looking at the book, as if time momentarily reversed. While its presence is essential to the critique that the film offers, this single frame shot and at least 10 similar unreadable flashes throughout the film have, for obvious reasons of invisibility, been ignored by critics of the film. In her excellent book, Joseph Cornell, Stargazing in the Cinema, Jody Hopman describes Bookstalls as being about a boy opening a book, the viewer seeing the boy's adventures brought to life through film, and the boy closing the book. I would argue that if the film's reader fails to account for Cornell's stuttering montage of the fragments of travel-related material, particularly those that we cannot see except by pausing, the film itself is literally not seen, nor understood for what it is. Cornell's painstaking frame-by-frame construction of his films and the clear directions that he gave his assistants about not correcting what might appear to be an error, such as upside down, backward, and flashed images, must be understood to be of a piece with a meticulous juxtaposition of ephemera in his larger project. The next section of Bookstalls continues the subtle formal play with the material and conceptual qualities of the medium. A series of 4 images of large chateaux surrounded by gardens or pools begins. The proximity of the camera causes the viewer to see the first image as a still until the page on which it appears is suddenly turned. The second apparently still image is turned by a hand entering the bottom of the frame, but the third and fourth images contain movement and thus are cinematic in themselves, rather than being stills embedded in film. The sequence ends with an intertitle that flashes so quickly as to be almost invisible and certainly unreadable. In this brief sequence, Cornell has shaken the viewer's faith in the image on multiple levels. When one is uncertain as to what one is seeing, a photograph, a film, a photograph in a film, written text, it is logical to begin to question the relationship between film and the world. The goal of this unsettling segment comes into focus with the next shot of the film, an intertitle from a travelogue, quote, "The Caledonia Canal, 60 miles long, crosses Scotland from the Atlantic to the North Sea. We make a record-breaking trip by water through the Highlands," end quote. The next shot at first makes sense. A large tourist ferry is winding its way through a picturesque canal. The direction of the smoke from the boat's chimney and the speed of movement, however, quickly make it clear that the film is not only in fast motion, but is reversed so that the boat is moving backwards. In the subsequent shot, which is similar but from a different angle, another extremely brief bit of film flashes by of a man at a desk looking out a window at ships in the distance, an image that is only visible when the film is paused. Following this segment are 5 shots of various boats in rough seas from all angles and distances. The 4th shot is anomalous in that there is a person in the bow of the vessel, what appears to be a young man in a dramatic, old-fashioned flared coat, and another jaunty hat in profile pulls a pair of binoculars up to his face and looks out to the right. From here on, about a quarter of the way in, the film is a montage of travelogue footage from 2 distinct sources, a film about the Dutch island of Marken and another about a rice-gathering community in an unspecified Asian country. If the viewers simply engage with the content of the film, they will see fragments of travelogue footage, folkloric dress and headgear, intriguingly shaped boats and buildings, and the labor of farming communities. Both sets of people do basically the same things. They lean into water, they bend to gather, stack, and transport vegetation. They look into the camera uncomfortably as it regards them. Both communities have children dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing who play at adult behavior or assist in the labor. But given the formal arrangement of the material, which I focus on more closely below, it is clear that Cornell's interest in the original movies did not stem from the subject, nor from the traditional narrative-based arrangements of shots in the films. I would argue with Carter Radcliffe, who described Cornell as a man who let himself be guided by the, quote, movies, the most picturesque medium of all, with its lighting effects, its sound effects, and above all, its special effects, end quote. On the contrary, Bookstalls makes evident that the stories and stars of the movies that Cornell collected and re-edited were of virtually no importance in his larger project. In fact, his observation about his copy of Paul Lenny's 1924 film Waxworks reveals that the opposite was the case. He wrote that the film was, quote, unfortunately a copy, but its density accidentally produces in spots an unbelievable living realm of golden shadows like Caravaggio, end quote. It was the combination of the film's materiality as a print of the world, along with its ephemerality, and particularly the marks of the film caused by the passage of time, that interested him. The fact that the footage used in Bookstalls came from conventional travelogues provided the ground for a film that offers, if not an anti-colonialist critique, a thought-provoking universalist statement that brings attention to the colonialist mindset. The young, dramatically dressed man looking through the binoculars seems to take us to Marken's picturesque harbor, where the pace of the film becomes agreeably moderate and the quality of the footage quite even. Yet before the tourist gaze begins to make sense of the place, an almost invisible image flashes, an image that on inspection appears to contain a long, thin boat pushed by people dressed in ways that are more characteristic of an Asian country than a Dutch one. The following shot is an intertitle, quote, boatloads of tourists arrive daily, end quote, followed by images of these tourists, men smoking in straw boaters, animatedly talking amongst themselves and paying little attention to the world they have ostensibly come to see. The previous intertitle is then completed, quote, and take possession of Marken's narrow ways, end quote. In the following shots, the tourists continue to move along the raised wooden sidewalks with an almost machine-like regularity, largely ignoring the local women who seem to be offering them things to purchase. The next intertitle reads, quote, the tourists gone, Big Marken resumes its homely tasks, end quote, followed by men and women forking, loading, and stacking hay in a segment that is all but duplicated in rice fields in the Asian footage to come. In the middle of this fairly decipherable material, the logo of a film appears, in which the profile silhouette of a man in a pith helmet is encircled by the words, quote, a Burton Holmes travel picture, end quote. The next intertitle, quote, the Isle of Marken, we arrive on Monday morning, end quote, is followed by the same folkloristically dressed men, women, and children of Marken washing and hanging up clothes, wandering in a piazza, and pushing a baby in a carriage. The temporal confusion here is analogous to the earlier shot of Paris, in which the boy is shown reading after he has closed the book and put it away. Again, Cornell forces the viewer to question the relation of the film to reality. Did the earlier reverse motion shot of the ferry in the canal take us back in time? Have we reversed again? Are we experiencing a series of time loops? But the deeper question is raised when the next intertitle, a repeat of an earlier one saying, quote, boatloads of tourists arrive daily, end quote, is followed by an extreme long shot from an airplane of a flat field divided into irregular shapes, and then another flashed image. From this point onward, the footage is taken from the Asian rice harvesting travelogue, in which the actions, movements, and gestures of the Marken dwellers are all but repeated in a parallel pattern, but in different costume, in a different landscape. The critique at the heart of the film occurs in this repetition and in the recognition that the travelogues are all but interchangeable. Paradoxically, although the films give evidence that a certain place and time exist, they do not provide knowledge of the world as much as a comforting illusion of knowledge. The interchangeability suggests that the effect of the travelogue is to reduce our experience and comprehension of the world. In the cinema, Cornell found an apparatus that was comparable to the telescope and the microscope as technologies of seeing that enable the human eye to perceive what had previously been unavailable to it. Cornell's faith in film as simultaneously evidence of the world's existence and a means to see it anew via montage was of a piece with Dziga Vertov's notion of the cinema as a more perfect eye. What Bookstalls reveals through the transposable Marken Asian footage, through the collapsing reversal distortion of the conventional narratives of the travelogue through editing, but mostly through the 10 flashes that punctuate the film, is our own misguided sense that we may know the world through photographs and films. We may see fragments of spaces and moments of time that once actually existed in Bookstalls, but the flashes of things that we literally cannot see destroy the all-important sense of presence for which film is known and valued, and refuses the viewer the experience of epistemological control. While Bookstalls offers a sophisticated critique of both the travelogue and the power of cinema to provide a sense of mastery over the world, it is also a dreamscape with a complicated connection to the material world. A devout Christian Scientist, Cornell and his work were shaped by the writings of Mary Baker Eddy, particularly those in her 1875 book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, which posits the non-existence of mortal mind and matter and the immortality of the divine mind or spirit. Critic Sandra Starr called Cornell, quote, a metaphysical scientist, end quote, perfectly capturing the fusion of the technological and the ephemeral that drove his thinking and work. Starr's observation that Cornell utilized Eddy's practice of writing in opposites so that, quote, traditional worldly meanings of words are replaced by spiritual ones, end quote, is particularly enlightening in regard to his unique filmmaking process. One might say that Cornell's reversals, condensations, elisions, and repetitions of found footage preclude the viewer from seeing what the image seems to reveal. Through their rejection of linear time and haptic space and their insubstantial and fragile material base, the films suggest that Cornell wanted the viewer to see beyond the world. They present a paradoxically concrete embodiment of Christian Science concepts, given that they do not exist except when they are being projected, and the projected images are gone a 24th of a second after they are seen. Cornell may have seen an affinity between Eddy's definition of ideas as, quote, emanations from the divine mind, end quote, and metaphysics as the resolution of, quote, things into thoughts, end quote, and the material state of film. The links between Cornell's art and religious beliefs intersect in the principle of what Eddy called intuition, which he defined as, quote, God's thoughts passing to man, quote, end quote, or angels. Cornell was known for fairly eccentric work habits in which he gathered and stored, often for many years, random material that had somehow resonated with experiences in the world that he described as epiphanies. These fragments, which he called métaphysiques d'éphémérat, are not related to simple nostalgia or sentiment, but rather mark a profoundly felt unity of past and present. It seems likely that Cornell's continual attraction to film as a medium is linked to his appreciation of its dialectical nature in this regard. Film paradoxically provides actual evidence of past moments in time and simultaneously offers the world to us in all its excessive presence with each projection. One of the most remarkable of Cornell's diary entries from a series of notes written over several days in early 1969 was the following, presumably written after finding something important to him. He writes, and yet this discovery came as a byproduct only in the final tracking down of a passage remembered but overlooked time and time again in that curiously plaguing phenomenon of purposely not trying to find desired things, end quote. The dreamscape came into being when he tracked down the banal and worthless pieces of the world and juxtaposed them according to an enigmatic logic that subsumed matter and mind to reveal what Eddy called the, quote, substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, end quote. The final shots of Bookstalls return the viewer to the close-up of the boy in the jaunty cap over whose shoulder we look as we looked at the start of the film, as he gazes into a book from the bookstall. He returns the book and the film dissolves to a long shot of the same street with other readers poring over the books in the stalls. This shot then dissolves into an image identical to the close-up of the boy, but he has been replaced by a man. And yet another dissolve replaces this man by a younger man in a similar cap. This original world, the frame that holds the transfigured travelogue footage, is itself in temporal flux, however stabilized it is by the streets of Paris. Although he was devoted to all that was transitory, the most powerful trope in Cornell's work is that of containment. in which intuition led him to gather ephemeral images and objects, and then link and hold them in one exquisitely unstable place. In reaction to a description by Carter Radcliffe of Cornell as a, quote, maestro of absences, end quote, Mary Ann Cause describes Cornell as, quote, an assembler of presences, end quote, in a contradiction that embodies Cornell's use of matter to posit its non-existence. But it is Rosalind Krauss who offers the most grounded explication of Cornell's formal project. In an essay about the ways in which the grid functions in modernism, Krauss employs Cornell's box, Nouveau Conte Fait, poison box of the late 1940s, as an example. She argues that the format of the grid can be seen to operate either centrifugally or centripetally, and I would contend that Cornell's grids in the boxes work centripetally, that is, they move us inward. The particular box that Krauss uses as an example is divided into 15 cubes, 3 across and 5 down. Each compartment contains a small box with its top and base separately wrapped in pages from an illustrated book, while the box itself is covered in paper depicting scenes of 19th century French fairy tales. The piece works by pulling viewers in, as if taking them on a journey through time. The box itself contains boxes within boxes, containing perhaps more boxes. The unseeable interiors of the boxes are not unlike the flashes in Bookstalls. They are right in front of us, but wholly unknowable. Krauss continues to posit that other types of grids operate centrifugally, suggesting that they are but a fragment of an infinite grid. The use of the grid created by a paned window revealing the world outside being a good example. Although Krauss is not concerned with the cinema in her essay, her work suggests the ways in which all films with a photographic base are inevitably centrifugal. Given their means of production, films cannot help but present fragments of the larger world. No matter how wide the lens and active the camera, only a portion of infinite space can be seen, regardless of how powerfully it is suggested by the conventions of the medium. It is precisely these conventions that Cornell rejects in his editing of the travelogue footage. A frame-by-frame examination of a film, in which each frame is understood as a metonymic fragment of the world, reveals that a projected film operates centripetally by pulling the frames together into a new whole. In the case of Bookstalls, however, this whole refuses interpretation. On the other hand, we might conceive of all of the supposed films that Cornell made as fragments of one single film that, in its remarkable diversity, suggests infinite space and time. It is vital to remember that images were often repeated across several of Cornell's films, and that he neither titled his films nor attached to them credits or text of any kind. Linda Hartigan supports this notion of the single film in describing Cornell's films, boxes, and collages as variants, in which are never done but continually worked on as, quote, installments in a larger continuous narrative of recurring themes and changing features, end quote. She is responding not only to Cornell's tendency to create multiple boxes on a theme, such as Soap Bubbles or Emily Dickinson, but to Cornell's request throughout his life for the return of boxes possessed by others for further work. Where the boxes were inherently separate and fixed, no matter how often aspects of them were altered, the simplicity of the film frame and the process of montage, the invisible linking of one frame to another with boundless variation, corresponded to Cornell's notion of time's omnidirectional flow and the non-existence of matter. The notion of each film as a variant of an infinite films returns us to the critical project of Bookstalls, in which the random travelogue footage of Marken and the unnamed Asian country are but variants on notions of the unknowable other. Cornell's montage juxtaposes the same actions and gestures in different costumes and makes the point that the tourist's gaze is not one that sees and knows the world, but rather the opposite. Cornell challenges what may be supposed to have been the original intent of the footage, thus refusing the viewer the gratifying sense of having mastered the world through the camera's authoritative gaze. Bookstalls disintegrates the conventional travelogue footage that it contains in ways that are baffling, critical, and finally evocative of an interior journey through time at the expense of physical space and certainty. Yet, in the spirit of opposites that drove Cornell, I conclude by noting the degree to which the footage featured in Bookstalls also revels in the daily lives of the subjects in the travelogue, particularly that of the children. The haphazard movement, expression, and motivation of the latter in much of Cornell's work seems to be emblematic of the freedom of the spirit when mind and matter are overcome. The films contain a surfeit of the seemingly unrelated bits of the everyday world that Cornell valued for the potential to help others engage in what he called, quote, the warp and woof of daily life, end quote. In a 1986 lecture on the uncanniness of the ordinary delivered at Stanford, Stanley Cavell notes that, quote, the everyday is what we cannot help but aspire to, since it appears to us as lost to us, end quote. It seems only appropriate that the final image of the film is one that is overtly deteriorating. The bubbles of emulsion at its edges literalize the work of time and manifest the non-existence of matter. While Bookstalls perhaps inadvertently presents the modern viewer with a critique of the travelogue, it also epitomizes cinema's definitive and unsurpassed ability to return us to the world again and again in a perpetual loop of absent presence and present absence. Thank you for your attention.
Well, if everybody could for a moment, I think we should turn our mics on and give her a round of applause. That was a great reading. Thank you. So, do you mind everybody giving us a little clap, because it might not happen later because of the way we're running through things.
Right. Thank you.
That was really packed full. In ways that I'm sure we could all take tangents going every which direction. If anybody has any direct comment at this moment, it's a good time to speak up. And if not, as we proceed, do interject and speak up. But please, if anyone out there would like to respond right away, good. And if not, we'll jump right back into Bookstalls again. How's that? Is a good way of I wanted to first of all, thank you. It was very generous of you. We did an earlier reading of this and recorded it in the week because we weren't sure if Robin would make it in time. Um, so between the other reading and reading her essay proper, I've had a lot of time with it, where most of you might be coming to it fresh. And I thought that maybe the way to deal with this, because it's so, what's the old word, heavy, in a great way, but it is packed. Is maybe we look at some of the things you spoke about in Bookstalls, because what we're seeing, and this has been a problem across the board with Cornell, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is that he made copies of copies, and then the copies we're seeing today are copies of copies, and we're so lucky to have the video that we showed because of Robert Lehrman, a huge Cornell collector and aesthetician about the work and whatnot, made these videos back in, I guess, 2005, I think is when he did them. And for all of his wonderfulness and generosity, he also had no clue of what to do with film and video at the time. And I only know this because I entered the project right at the very end. And to great chagrin, it was like there's so many problems with those transfers that are in the package. Like example in Bookstalls, that print has color tints and tones through it in the material, but we're seeing a black and white version, which is sad. But in the way Times worked itself out, that is the only version we can see. So do you see my point? And it fits into what you're saying very much so. In a serendipitous sort of way. So I thought if I can put up the film on our screen share, and I can show it slower, actually, which is the way it was meant to be shown, actually, at about 16 frames a second, and we can point out a few of these things that you pointed out, because they do fly by, and they're very, very important to understanding how the film literally viscerally works on you when you're watching it. So does that sound like an idea? Does that work? Yeah. Okay, so let me find it. I gotta do a couple, gymnastics here to get the page stuff. I have it here somewhere. Okay, there it is there. And because of your writing an essay, I came up with a great set of stills to reinforce what we're going to see this way. Wait a minute, I'm doing the wrong thing here. Let me focus for 2 seconds. Hold on. I want to actually show the movie on my screen, right? Yes. Okay, so we do it here. And here, so you're all not totally bored. Where are we here? Anybody want to speak up while I'm footling around here? It would be really appreciated, because it would help. Okay, here we go. Okay. Oh, I pressed the wrong button again. One more time. Let's see if we can do this. This is like a circus act in itself. Okay, so there we go. Let's see if we got the playback. I want to go down about 72% is about 16 frames a second. So there's your beginning. Are we all seeing the film now? Somebody speak up, because I can't.
Okay. Yes, we see it, or at least I do.
Okay, so these are the shots of Paris, and we also have the problem now of the digital, artifacts that have built into this thing through all the stuff we talked about earlier. But nonetheless, everybody kind of knows Paris, right? But here's the catch. Right away, the slowness makes the dirt and things stand out that Robin was speaking of. The film artifacts, because they're on screen longer, so you see them. But what's fascinating here is we're going along, like she said, and then all of a sudden we're someplace else. We're not in Paris anymore. So hold on a second. We'll let it play a little slow. We're in Hollywood. That's what this is. This is Burbank. Which makes perfect sense for Cornell. And the other thing that comes up while watching these images or the travelogues and everything that she's speaking of, and do speak up, Robin, don't let me just go on, is the images show up in other films. These same sort of images, reflecting back on the film industry. which Cornell was now part of. And very much was so, working in the industry, so to speak, in the mid-30s. He was doing publicity, collage work, actually, for to 37, 38. Now, we were able to see the rupture much better in the slower speed, correct? I guess you know. There's a series of them here, and we see the scratches, which the scratches and dirt are caused by a rip in this section and a repair.
Bruce, I have a question.
Sure.
How'd you come up with the 16 frames per second? I mean, Cornell didn't leave any instructions, I assume, as to what speed it would be projected at.
If time permits, thank you, Rich. If time permits, we're getting it to a little talk that P. Adam Sitney gave in 1979 when this film was first shown in Pittsburgh. And he talks about the speed issues, and he was in direct contact with Cornell.
Oh,
so that's where I'm taking this from.
Talked to him before he died.
Yeah, when they got the films at Anthology and then preserved them.
Yeah.
So it is a fact, so to speak, the slower speed.
Okay, no, I was just curious.
And you know, at the least, it's a good question, Rich, because at the least it also makes these things we're talking about stand out. Whereas at 24 frames a second, a lot of these things rush by, these visual effects, like this transition that Robin so brilliantly pointed out, of going from the movie footage to the still photo, to the still photo being a book, and then a hand enters a picture and starts turning the pages, and then we're back to the movie again. I mean, it's brilliant. And boom, boom, boom. Now, in this little section we just saw is 1 minute. Okay, and then it moves on to other stuff, which I can't remember what's next here. Okay, the boat, which is a pixelated image to begin with. Maybe the best way to do this is go to some slides here. I think it might be the best way. I think if they'll come up. Robin, I made these special for you, Robin. In my own personal work, where I got lost, I was saying at the beginning of the program, I got lost because I've entered into examining all of Cornell's splices. And I'm almost done with Rose Hobart from beginning to end, documenting every splice, right? And that is like such, it tells you a whole different story about what Cornell's trying to do, because one issue is the narrative and the stories he's telling you, or the stories he's telling you that other people told you. And then the way he's interpolating them, like Robin was saying, into this higher metaphysical realm, theoretically, which is probably true, or this epiphany, or whatever those words are. But this is what we were just seeing, but it's slowed down. So that's the first splice, and that's in the sequence. And you notice there's the splices and the noise related to horizontal lines. Sometimes the film he took it from, sometimes a mistake that he fixed, sometimes something as wild as this. These are all in sequence. I'm going between the scenes, the sequences that are normally moving, and then just seeing where the splices occur. This is incredible, and it's also backs up exactly what Robin said by the next frame is this. Now, without examining the actual print itself, to have this frame here you're seeing and this frame here is next to impossible unless somehow Cornell manufactured these. And I don't think it's the video transfer of Lerman. I think it's in the film print. But you see the bubbles she's talking about. And the other thing about the bubbles is that in different Cornell's splice, he makes different splices in different films in different ways. So you can kind of time stamp the films and is working on them by the type of splices and bubbles. These bubbles appear in all these collages we're dealing with tonight, but they do not appear in Rose Hobart. Okay, so this sequence is this. It's this, and then it's clear. The other thing Cornell did structurally was he always did things on movements. See this pan? And then there's a break in the film, and you see the bubbles clearly, right? And the film goes over here, and it's breaking all the way along. I don't think these are, you can see the leftover scratches from the break, ran through the projector wrong. Do you see what I mean? The white scratches. These are, anybody that's handled 16 millimeter film and had it break has manufactured these splices or these mistakes themselves, right? Okay. But my point is this, and then there's a dissolve in the film, in the original film itself. Okay, but he capitalizes on that. I'm going backwards. Okay, we're going to go forward. So the dissolve's happening, and then there's the splices we've seen, the bubble splices, but then he throws in something, and this is what kinges it for me, that this is important to do, and this is part of what Cornell is trying to tell us in life, in his life. He cuts in a diagonal splice, which is a diagonal splice. You see the big white line on top? And the darker one at the bottom here. That was a certain type of splicer at the time that's in a lot of his films, and you see it in a lot of films from the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. But he consciously has put this in here to match the diagonals in the book stall. Do you see? He was doing all horizontal splices before this point, and then he doesn't come back to it again. Then we change back to the scene. And again, here's another example of him clearly articulating, this vision of splices. The horizontal line matches, but then the patterning of the bubbles matches the patterning of the topiaries and plants. Mm-hmm. You see this over and over again in his films. I'm not making this stuff up. And then the stills, there's a still, but then it still turns into a movie. Right.
Bruce, can I ask a question of clarification, please?
Yeah, sure.
Were you saying
all over the place?
So I understand what you were saying, is that the only diagonal splice in Bookstalls?
I don't know if it's only one, but it's clearly placed in this sequence.
Oh, I agree. I was just, I didn't quite understand what you were saying, whether it was the only one in this section or the only one in the film.
Yeah, what my contention is here, not even contention, it's a fact. He consciously was watching these things as he was making them. They weren't just the film being broken because he was showing it to Robert and then he fixed the film. Well, maybe that's how it started, because everybody has that problem showing 60 millimeter film at home. But when he was working, editing, he capitalized on these errors. Okay, so we have this thing, which again, I don't know if it's true or not, right? Because of the video transfer and the way video back then interpolated frames. So one frame, that's why it was hard to make these stills. One frame is sometimes 2 frames, but still it makes no sense why that would be there. But watch, the diagonals enter the picture. The original film plays on the diagonals and the movement. But then the minute his cuts come in, do you see how there's a spatial divide happening? He's abstracting space prior to the abstract expressionist breaking up space. It repeats itself. It's in Rose Hobart. It's in, and these films are all the same time period. They're not like one was made and then another. They were all made together or simultaneously. Again, there's diagonals and there's verticals, and there's wonderful visual issues happening here. Also, when the splices happen in 16, you have it on the bottom of the frame, and then the next frame has it on the top. It's the way the overlap splice actually physically worked in any 16 millimeter film using that type of splicer. So where was I going to go with this? There was one last thing I wanted to show you before we move on. Oh, another device that he uses over and over again in his films, especially with using these found footage films, is he's doing this thing with stills. He's doing this thing with motion and stills. But then he'll cut to a shot, and I think this is less than 10, 15 frames, where it's cut on a fade out. The scene's fading out, but there's also action in the scene. You can't really see it here, but the birds in the center where the people are taking off again, like they were here. So the motion starts again and continues, and then it cuts to another fade out that starts fading in, but then it's broken up by a splice. And it goes to this, and this particular title holds for a while, which is, Robin was pointing this out. You don't see a lot of this because it's happening within 12 frames or 2 frames or 6 frames. Just to underline again, like I said, there's a dramatic, these are dramatic pictures by themselves, let alone in motion. These are 2 consecutive frames spaced appropriately apart as they would on a piece of film. This is that diagonal business. You see how the diagonal splice, you can pretty much see how it works if you had the piece of film in front of you, the 2 parallel diagonal lines. This is an amazing image, isn't it? mean, it's beautiful. And you have to remember that in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, from the running from beginning to end, Cornell was really seeing them like this, as he's editing the film from left to right. So he was also seeing another graphic set of images occurring too. And this other thing earlier that was in the film is just absolutely stunning either way you see it. So, Robin, this is for you in return for your brilliant paper.
This is fascinating, Bruce. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got to find out how to get back to Zoom. I always get lost in where's. Oh, I got to turn off the screen share, right? Sorry, I thought you might like that because your paper just inspired me to.
Good.
There's so much hidden in these films that people haven't engaged with because of all the reasons we were saying earlier, all kinds of reasons, and they're complicated. These are complex images. The other thing I thought was important that we dwell on if we have the time, which I think we do sort of. We have a few minutes. We're behind but ahead. Is some of the other films he made at the same time. We should take a look at to re-emphasize everything you just read to us. And they're pretty fine examples, and they're of the exact same time period. And the two choices I pulled out were The Children's Jury, which is actually, it's on the can it says New Newsreel. And it's clearly documented in so many different ways, one being a letter to Jay Leda in 1938 where he talks about, I want to come down and show it to you. And it turned up in the films when they were given to Anthology. And the other film is At Night by Torch and Spear. Again, another film that was in that pile that went to Anthology. And again, of the same time period. These are these multiple piles. So to tie it together, which would be really nice, and it comes back into that 40-year business, those 40-year cycles I mentioned at the beginning, was when the films first were shown and first preserved by Anthology in 1978. P. Adam Sidney was at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh and gave a wonderful Cornell talk, but he talked specifically about what at the time they were calling, and correctly so, goofy newsreels of Cornell. So does that sound good to jump into? Is everybody ready for that? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our We Together thing. Does everybody have the where is that stupid chat thing? God, there's so many buttons. No, that's YouTube. That's the wrong button. You don't want to press that one to so and so. Let me find the thing here. We're going to go back to We Together, and we're going to watch about, what is it there, 20 minutes of stuff? It's directly to the Howe, everybody in the meeting. I don't even know how anybody invented this Zoom stuff. It's off the charts that somebody thought up half this stuff. So we will see you all in 25 minutes, which is good. And then we can chat up a storm and talk about all this stuff we've seen. Does that make some kind of sense? Okay, let's see if I can go there. So everybody's moving over to W2 Together address, right? Okay, and I'm going to push the button, and I have to find Sydney first. It's give me a second to get my little act together again here. This is the beginning. You'll hear Robert Haller introduce. For those of you who know Robert, it's always a treat to hear Robert. 2918.
There's no smoke in this room. In case there should be a fire, observe that in case there should be, not only can you get out the door you came in, but also through this door. I want to remind you that tomorrow.
Okay, as Robert reminds you, Sydney was talking about all the films, and this is after about an hour or so of speaking. So I hope I got the right spot.
Now I want to show you two films about which I know very little. These were two of the either 8 or 11 films found by our archivist Rick Stanberry and Sean Leaka in cans at Anthology Film Archives. We only have 2 of them for several reasons. It is very, very expensive to preserve film. Just to to make one copy of each one of these films. First copy cost $500 apiece. The exceptional graciousness of the Cornell family made this possible, especially his sister, Betty Cornell Benton. We didn't know whether they could be preserved, and still some of them are so shrunken that we don't know if we'll ever be able to make copies of them. One of the films, the first one, I've seen a few times. It's never been shown in public before. The other one, I am in deep ignorance about. I saw it once this morning. It came from the lab this morning. It has been projected once in its history, aside from when the original was projected. And you'll certainly be the first audience to see it, and you'll know just about as much about it as I do when we see that one. But first we will see one of these edited films of Cornell's, which may have been what he meant by goofy newsreels. It may have been the kind of what he called shows for Robert. He collected films to show his brother, and he played around with the films to make them more amusing sometimes for his invalid brother, to whom he devoted considerable amount of his attention and much of his life. So let's have, first of all, these are both silent speed. The first of what may be goofy newsreels. Closing the book. I only want to say a word about this. I mean, it's an absolutely simple film. So simple, perhaps one of the reasons that Cornell never wanted to release it as a film of his own. He has simply taken two of his favorite subjects and combined them, but in an interesting and significant way. On the one hand, his immense love of Paris, especially of 19th century Paris, of the world of Parisian poets, and of the image of the flaneur, this 19th century figure who would stroll the boulevards, stopping to see what amuses him, a figure out of Baudelaire. And his immense love of travel films, especially travel films that show the exotic and universal behavior of children. What Cornell has done is folded one into the other, so that as the young man wanders the streets of Paris, opens up books, he imaginatively travels. In the books he sees pictures of strange places, which opens up onto his mind these vistas of exotic travelogues, and then he closes the book and they're over. What Cornell is suggesting to us then is that a certain equation exists for him, both between the act of reading, the imaginative journey he derived from primarily poetry, and the kind of imaginative activity that watching films was involved for him. Cornell was a man who never moved far from New York City, who did all of his traveling in books or in films, but really did most of his traveling in the imagination. And there's a small little film about the combination of that book traveling, film traveling, all adding up to primarily imaginative travel. The next fragment, the one that we saw just a little bit at the beginning of, you could roll it back to the beginning, can't you? The next fragment is the one we just finished up this morning. Well, we'll see it, and I'll hope to be able to say something about it, a sentence or two. Won't be able to say too much. These goofy newsreels may have been assembled as many as 40 years ago, shown perhaps in Julian Levy's gallery in New York, shown quite likely to Robert and Mother at home. I don't know them well enough to do anything more than share them with you, but I find it quite remarkable that Cornell, who loved these films and these episodes in and of themselves, had the ability to so slightly alter them, to bring one, two of them together, to bestow upon them something that they are in themselves and show them to us in a way simply by this act of combination, that we see them through his eyes to some extent. And we find ourselves again, 40 years later, coming out to see an evening of what amounts to be seal acts and how many would have come out for an evening of seal acts, trapeze acts, etc. Cornell has somehow restored them to us as they are, and with the slightest touches has managed to preserve the kind of exuberant enthusiasm he himself found in their goofy qualities that become all the more goofy by combination.
The goofy is back, sort of. Maybe. I hope so. Did it come back? Yes. Are we there, Robin?
Yes.
Ah, there we
There
are.
you go.
It was a great choice on your part. That was a good move.
Right. I'm curious as to whether anybody else is working on Cornell or has
Oh, tons.
different approaches.
Tons. Cornell's cause de celeb everywhere, worldwide.
I wonder in this group.
Oh, here. That's a very good question. Yeah. Anybody? Please speak up. I know Rich is a huge aficionado, beneficiary of Cornell's work and legacy, and I'm not sure who else is all out
I
there.
know Keon is, yeah.
Okay, Keon is okay. All right, Becky, Patrick Frill probably is, I guess. But certified scholars, I'm not sure. I think you're it tonight.
Well, I wonder if there's some projects. I know Keon's has written. Are you still working on him at all now?
I am. I took a big break to be a dad.
Yeah.
But I'm coming back to it now.
Oh, good. Yeah. Anything you could share with us?
Yeah, please. That's great. Yeah.
Like Bruce, I am looking at the splices in Rose Hobart very intently.
Oh, good.
And like you, Robin, looking at things that are too brief and ephemeral to be noticed during ordinary projection.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting patterns of damage, single frames, and my cat. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Apparently, I'm not paying enough attention to him.
That's so interesting, and I'm glad you're back to it.
Me too. We should hook up. We should hang out sometime.
Yeah.
Off the table, buddy.
There's a close up of a transition in Rose Hobart that I thought would fit into what we're talking about here. One of the things besides the lines and the glue and all that stuff that we talked about earlier is that the thickness of the splice in the printer makes the image jump out of focus. Mm. So you see the image of Rose below. Well, 1 or 2 frames later, she's crystal clear again. So there's a very interesting rhythmic patterning that goes on from that going out of focus that he clearly was aware. He was aware of everything, it seems. I don't think anything didn't pass his scrutiny. as he was, delving into this, like all of his other work. I just thought you might like to see that. It was amazing when I realized, oh, that's an aesthetic in and of itself. Just this brief one frame, 1/24th of a second or 1/16th of a second fuzziness that goes with the jump of the splice, and he's clearly playing with that too. It was, he understood it. He understood the whole thing, the whole process. He understood how to, in the last film, the Night by Torch and Spear. What strikes me is astounding is the level of abstraction that he leads to. I showed you a couple frames earlier from the Bookstalls where it gets very abstract. Every Cornell film has one, this is a fact, one part where there's an extreme abstraction beyond anything the abstract expressionists ever came up with. And it's usually 1/24th or a couple frames, but it's that intense. And it's funny that it's there. He could have easily cut those frames out. But it seems the opposite. He tendered them along.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, he has so many alterations in every possible realm with the flipped text, which I find so interesting because you don't know what to do with it. You might start to read it and you can't do it. We keep missing from the different jumps, the back, the negative, the flip frame, the freeze frame, everything that he does to make us actually not see what's on the screen is what has always been interesting to me. And so Margaret's asking Margaret about how well P. Adams knew Cornell. I think he knew him as a young man. I think he was 19 when he first went out to meet him. And I don't think anyone knew him well. It's my impression. I think he knew many people. I think, I'm trying to think, there was a poet who knew him very well. Who am I thinking of, Bruce?
There's a ton of them. That's the problem.
Probably Mina Loy.
Knew him well. Ken?
Probably Mina Loy.
Mina Loy, absolutely. There were few people that he was really close to, I felt. Just, I spent a lot of times in the archive looking for him talking about film. I was just interested in how connected he was to the medium. And what I discovered was that he was more connected to film than to anything else. And one of my favorite letters was one that Julian Levy wrote him in 1959, where clearly Levy asked Cornell he wanted to do a show, and Cornell must have said, I only want to show my films, because Levy wrote and said, okay, but I'll have to see all the films again. Right. So later he got in his career, the more he was focused on his films. And my feeling has been it's because he found in the medium what he wanted to say, right? Where he was approximating it in the boxes, he found it in the films.
Interesting. Yeah. That's extremely fascinating. And Levy is circumscribes his whole film career. Day one is when it kind of blossomed. The goofy movies, goofy newsreels, I forget the term, goofy movies was a term. It was a major term in the world in the mid-30s. Being so big that MGM had a series called Goofy Movies in 1934. And there's all kinds of other variations on Goofy that were in, it was there. It was in front of the public, clear as day. But it in that term is the Goofy's goofy in the sense that there's different levels of what goofy means. And as much as Cornell focused on certain kind of travelogues, he also focused on certain kind of goofy movies because he had choices to make. And that's fascinating and something that no one yet has really dug into, the differences. And you can see it in his hard work, his print work, his collages and whatnot too. He was doing these Joe Goop newspapers, 32, 33, 34. And they matched that sensibility of goofiness in their provincial approach to the news and all that. But back to the people that know him, the stories from everybody are so amazing. The best, and they're online too, which you can see now from Carnegie Museum, that same series that Sidney was involved with in '78, was Carolee Schneemann came and did a couple performances on her relationship with him.
Mhm.
And they're worth your while to listen to, because she was probably the closest and most conversant with him over a long period of time on that aesthetic realm,
Mhm.
aesthetic spiritual realm versus other disciplines.
Yeah, yeah, I felt that as well. One of the things that perplexes me, and Sidney does it in the beginning of this, the 1978 tape. He spends so much time describing how eccentric Cornell was, and talks about, when I met him, he was wearing this, and he told me about that, and he was eating this. And it just strikes me as strange how people are so invested in his oddness and in their encounter with his oddness. I can't think of another figure in contemporary art or at any time where that becomes the story, right? It's a full 15 minutes where Sidney just tells stories about Cornell's oddness.
I think. I mean, I could fire back right away easily when Warhol's a great, perfect foil. It might be a persona one takes in that world, but the Sidney thing is interesting. Well, you have to know Sidney too. Sidney, a lot of this has to do with Sidney being Sidney, and how Cornell, it was a matching, if not superior, intellect, and played Sidney in that way. That's the way I take it. Was that he was aloof. Cornell was aloof in ways that were maybe intentional or not. Ken Jacobs told me a great story recently, because I approached him about another subject related to Cornell and stuff. And he had his very quick and brief relationship with Cornell that didn't work out for what he wanted, and definitely not for what Cornell wanted. But part of that was taking Jack Smith out there to visit him. And Jack Smith, I think he went on his own, but he came back and he reported back to Ken. He said, "Oh, he's just an old fag hag. He's nothing." They didn't get along at all. There was a complete. So different personalities, you think would mix, didn't. You brought up in your paper something really important that the Star dealt with, but you bring up again, is Christian Science, and that's a whole ball of wax in this equation too.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you brought it up. So you want to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, that was one of the more interesting things that I learned as I read, all of the material in not all of it, but a lot of the material in the digital archives is, one of the things about it that I found most striking was that I found only one piece of paper, one whole piece of paper. And it was a letter after Robert died. Otherwise, everything is a fragment. It's a scrap of something, or a pamphlet. There's a very extensive brochure from a bank. And he has written around every margin and in every little space on both sides. So again, I'm thinking of Emily Dickinson, who is also the poet of the fragment, and who he was very interested in. I think he made 5 works for Emily Dickinson. Right?
Yeah, how could he not be?
Right. And then that's also the J. Lida connection as well with the Dickinson, which I think connected all 3 of them, because of course Jay wrote the days and hours of Emily Dickinson.
Yeah, which is I'm glad you brought this back, because I forgot to read that at the beginning. I found this great piece that conceptualizes the aesthetics. And where I found it, and I don't know where, I guess I spent hours sometimes in the Dartmouth Library, weeks. So, these things get on notes, and then I don't even remember where I saw them to begin with. But it's from a book by Alfie Murray, The Maid is Muse, which I assume you're familiar with. How Servants Changed Emily Dickinson's Life and Language, from 2009. And the quote is this: "Joseph Cornell's appetite for collage was fed by J. Lida. While he paved through thousands of Dickinson's manuscripts in the process of cataloging them, This is about the it says right here 1950s. Later wrote to Cornell in the 1950s about the ones he thought would most appeal, particularly Emily's penchant for cutting and pasting clippings, as well as her drawings and doodles. So it matches what you just said. Writing in The Word and Image, David Dunter comments that Dickinson and Cornell found an appeal in the, quote, irreverent logic and wit of intellectual collage. There it is, really concise, end quote. They both invented idioms for the modern age and together, quote, expanded the permissible stock of discourse, end quote. It encapsulates it very nicely.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then I would connect that to the Christian Science that is, I think he found in film that this paradox, right, that what seemed so real when the film is projected actually is gone in time, and then the emulsion of the print. That's his fondness, I believe, for the worst possible bits of film. There's in one of the diaries, he talks about having found some film in a wood pile and was all scratched, and how exciting that was because it bore the marks of time. And that's what he was interested in, was the sign of it, because it also, what was on there had existed and no longer did. So all of these ideas around Christian Science, and I'm not sure that we've mentioned, though you brought up how absolutely committed he was. That was his reality. And I know Sidney in that tape talks about
once he found it, found the church, and then eventually he became a member, which is a major commitment, because it's kind of like you got to be let in the club too. I mean, I guess they let in anybody, but there's still a process. And then it was a lifetime commitment. It never waned, and it gave him supposedly the most satisfaction, which makes perfect sense if you've been there. Explaining Christian Science from the inside to the outside is I've found, because I was one for 10 years, it's nearly impossible. It's inexplicable almost what goes on in that world, and it is very appealing under the Cornell rubric you've just laid out. Everything's perfect. God is love. I mean, I don't know. That's a big line of Mary Baker Eddy's. God is love, and the real world doesn't interfere with that. It doesn't exist.
The notion of the mother-father God, that it's a non-gendered figure.
Yeah, well, that was, of her time, in the sense of reaction to the hardships, of her own personal life. And it's an amazing move, because this became a worldwide, very dominant religion. Not people talk about it as a cult or something, which I guess you could see it that way. But it has roots everywhere. I mean, it reached out across the world, and it had an impact. It reinterpreted the Bible in a way that, the way I found it appealing personally, was the fact that it interpreted the Bible as maybe it should be interpreted. Why not God being love? And letting that, work its way through everything. But there are some practical issues there if you don't, believe the whole thing. Metaphysics, she called it. Mary Baker Eddy's metaphysics, which fit Cornell perfectly. You see it in his writings constantly, though. If you've obviously read a lot, it's just everywhere, and it's in the films. I mean, the film thing is fascinating to me, because at the time, he's not a mirror, but I don't know what the right word is, but he grew up with film, so to speak. Almost all the major stages of film, in his lifetime, he saw and remembered and loved fondly. And then he had this collecting thing where he, absorbed the things and the film stills. And it was a preservationist, because he kept films that at the time there weren't that many people doing that, besides private collectors. There weren't the archives and whatnot. So, there's this total, one of the interesting relationships I find with him, which is going somewhere else with this, is one of the labs he ran into was the guy Francis Dublier, who was a Lumiere cameraman, was running the lab. And they formed this weird relationship because of Cornell. I don't think they had any interest probably in Cornell at all, except for getting his films. You know, literally that collector's mentality of I can copy this guy's films. And in turn, Cornell got films back. But Cornell also got to hear stories about the original Lumiere brothers and the original shooting of the films. I mean, it's mind-bending to think. Anybody else have anything? We're going sideways. There's so much to talk about, but you know, Burton Holmes. Let's do that. We got time, I think, to squeeze in this little tidbit here. Everybody in all the films we saw tonight, what you talked about in your essay came up very clear as day. This duality of taking two different things and putting them together. The people in the Dutch and then the people in somewhere in Southeast Asia and doing work things that are matched. In the iron film, we see iron being made by men today and then ancients having some kind of ceremony with the torches. And, you know what I mean? And in the other film, the elephants doing logging and the men doing logging, right?
Yeah.
This goes on and on. I think as a quickie, and this is something I just found because I was looking around, I found all the films mostly, they were either Burton Holmes travelogues or they were Kodak educational movies that were widely available at the time, made in the 20s and by home market available that he recut. But I did come up with one little shorty, which I think we should play complete, just so people can walk away saying they've seen a Burton Holmes film. Does that?
Yeah, good idea.
Sound good? Unfortunately, almost they're very hard to find online, which is interesting with everything else being available. You know, but they're findable usually at stock footage places or in pieces. And I could show you one of the ones we saw tonight, but I think this one's more interesting because it impacts why I'd like to share this with you, besides the obvious what I just said, is later in the evening, for those who stay, you're going to get to see the Aviary, the later films, maybe with Rudy Burckhardt, an example of that. And Bryant Park, I think it is, he's shooting one morning. And he made a bunch of these sort of films in the mid-50s. There are the roots of this, I think, in this Burton Holmes travelogue about Antwerp, where you'll see almost the exact same footage shot by Burton Holmes, not Cornell. So let me fire this up. We're going to have to do this as a screen share. So let's see if I can do that without making everything go crazy. So many buttons and so little time. There we go. Okay. This is silent, I believe. It's 3-4 minutes. It's very short. Oh. There you go. You see it, right? It's all there.
That is such an interesting film. I've not been able to find any of them. It is so jagged. It's like a slideshow with the tiniest bit of movement in each frame. But Cornell's additions make it look coherent, right? That from what he puts on the ends.
Yeah, he'll slightly. What I've found to date, there's the other one that's the one of the elephants logging is also available online, and what you see in that is he basically either lifted a shot complete, or if it's a sequence of shots, he lifted them complete. He really didn't manipulate them. Besides lifting, in this particular case, is lifting a whole and dropping it. But in something like the Night. Torch and Spear, the film I think is called From Iron to Ore or Ore to Iron or whatever. It's a Kodak educational film. Just by flipping it upside down, radicalizes it. Well, something that was probably interesting to look at anyway, but you know, that and the color make it this spectacular graphic feast. It's almost like looking at you right now, the way you're set up with your pictures and things. There's this whole synergy going on that it's it's quite exciting. Robin, I'm sorry I talk so much as usual, which is my problem. Your paper is just phenomenal. I mean, it's concise and right to the point and very elaborate. So
that was really wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening.
Is it available online?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
So where is it?
So it's called Papers in Language and Literature.
Oh, I don't have the cover sheet.
I
don't have the cover sheet, but
yeah.
Is it forwards or backwards? It might be Cornell. You're getting it backwards, right?
No, that's right.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Well, I definitely have to look for it. I've been collecting materials on Cornell since the mid '70s, and it'll be wonderful to add it to my little collection.
If you can't find it, ask me. I'll send it to you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I can probably get your email from Bruce, I imagine.
Yeah, we can work this out. There was this letter from Rich here I was going to read. This is from 19. I mean, we'll close on this. Actually, I will read this letter. It's a nice. You'll see when I read it. But here's something I found in the pilot. You probably like. It's a nice picture of Jay.
I love that. Yes.
By Robert Howler from I'm not sure what year that is. 72, I think.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah, there's so much more to talk about. I wish we had more time, as they say. We didn't really dive into goofy newsreels in a more in-depth way, which I wish we could. I showed at the beginning the Man Ray film because the launching pad at Levy's Gallery for Cornell, the public launching pad, was a show called Goofy Newsreels. And it included Duchamp's Anemic Cinema, which Levy called Spirals, for whatever, I don't know what reason. And then the Man Ray film that we just saw. And then Goofy Newsreels by Cornell, which was probably the film that Sidney's referring to in the lecture. He showed, at that lecture from Carnegie, he showed Bookstalls, and then I'm pretty sure it's Goofy Newsreels, because Goofy Newsreels, the film itself, at least the one that Anthology has, there's 2 versions out, but one they have, it's really harsh in the way of everything we've talked about and trying to parse what's going on in it besides just these newsreels back to back. But in retrospect, with all the knowledge that's come to light, the people digging through these films, and especially the work of MoMA's done in the last 10 years, is it appears that Cornell worked in waves on multiple films, and he learned, and I think we saw it tonight pretty clearly, he learned editing tactics as he was going along from different types of montage that we saw in the different 3 films, and it expands to this very incredible abstraction in the one film, to Rose Hobart, who, one of the things MoMA, at least Ann Moore told me this a couple years ago, is when they did their survey, they found probably the original version, or at least a much earlier version of it, where in fact the narrative is much more like what I'm talking about, these spaced out kind of editing patterns that aren't clearly defined yet, where even Rose Hobart doesn't predominate in the edit. And at some point they're going to release it. And from what Julian Levy said of that showing, in retrospect in his book, it sounds like that was the issue, was these were very loose films that people couldn't get because they weren't, the jump wasn't totally made in his edits yet. So when people watch these films, am I making any sense here? The looseness of the associations, the tactile things weren't all happening yet. So I sensed that, but I think what was going on, I'm blah, blah, blahing for a reason here, is he was fighting against two major impulses. And one was Man Ray, in that film in particular, because that was available for him to see at Levy. And the other one is the work by Buñuel and Dali, which did everything he was doing, but they were doing it in a more narrative way, more literal way than where he obviously Cornell was coming from. And so this is important, I think. I mean, really important to understand that Man Ray, it's a foil. Am I making sense? Because there's not much that I've seen written about him and Man Ray relating, which is interesting. Because he did everything but be a lapdog for Duchamp and Dali. I mean, you know what I mean? He was, bowing at the altar, for all kinds of reasons. I'm being a little facetious here. Does anybody, Robin, do you want to say anything in response to this? Because it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I think about Cornell's work, I see him as more of as more intuitive, that he would, with the way he made the boxes, many things that he puts in are things he literally found at the moment of an experience. Like he'll talk about looking up at somebody in a bus and feeling this connection, and then seeing a scrap of ticket on the floor and picking it up, and it becomes the embodiment of the moment in time. And that's the kind of things you see in the boxes that are so odd, right? Or little plastic things, or sticks or something. And I guess I see his film collection as connected to that it was this more of an experiential, intuitive connection to the medium itself, as opposed to structuring any kind of a story. I mean, I guess, one of the things I said when I started was that I always found Cornell's films very difficult and challenging, right? Not Rose Hobart, which I saw, in grad school. And I thought, oh, I get that, I get it. But when I started seeing By Night, Torch and Spear, I just couldn't get a handle on it. I couldn't find anything. And I finally sort of concluded that the point of the job of the film critic with his films is to find a path that opens for you somehow, and then just go into it. And just the way he digs and juxtaposes the films he finds in the world, that's what I did with Bookstalls. I mean, I found a path through the traveler's gaze, and I found the film to offer a critique of it. That was my reading of it. I think there are many readings, and I think that's the great pleasure of these films, is all the options that they give you.
Well, they provide. Yeah, the Sydney thing, I really loved the little part that we played, because to hear Sydney not be able to say anything, in the way that he says things and in the way he perceives things, he was facing that wall too. What is this? Yeah. And of course he was just seeing it for the first time, the one film, but he was extremely inarticulate for Sydney. And where he went even in a couple years, by 1980 or 82, when the MoMA show and the catalog came out, he was able to talk about those films much clearer. But I know I've been fighting my whole creative, whatever life is, the curatorial life, trying to get people to watch New Newsreel. Because it goes right over almost everyone's head, like you're saying. It's baffling. What is this? What is happening in this film?
Well, I think with his films, they come closest to the aesthetic of the boxes, because they're they're mysterious, and yet, they pull you in and they make you want to figure it out, and you never do figure it out.
Mhm.
And that's their appeal, as opposed to the collages, which are, I think, much more fixed. And I think that there's a real connection between what he was trying to do in the boxes and what he was trying to do in the films.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been my take all along, was that the boxes were not quite satisfying enough, right? It's in the films that he finds what he was after. The boxes leave too much sort of room for charm, right? They're pretty, they're interesting, they're objects like a dollhouse, where the films seem to me the most rigorous sort of exploration of this, of time and sort of the deterioration of the materiality of the world, right? Which is what he was always trying to do through his Christian Science belief, but also kind of his relation to his world, to the banal, to the everyday, that is always lost to us. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that there's, in some of Cornell's boxes, especially the earlier ones, there's there's a good dose of sentimentality to some of them, and you don't see that in the films.
Right.
I don't find anything sentimental about the films, yet there are, boxes that are just a little too sentimental for my tastes, so in the films, I think, he escapes that.
Yeah.
Because he was prone to that, to being sentimental.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was saying, with some of the boxes, I think I read them that way, but I can imagine that he didn't, that these were things that he, found and purposefully lost in his shelves, and would go looking for them and try not to find them at the same time that he was looking for them. And so they were sort of imbued with a lot of sort of emotional weight somehow. And that
in the boxes.
Yeah.
In the boxes.
The objects,
that they would put in, that they might read as sentimental, but I think for him, they were full of some kind of experience.
The cross connects, I can't myself disavow, because he seemed to be, he's beyond a polymath in the sense of doing all these things, these objects, no matter what they were. And I'd like to show you all this really interesting cross corollary to the year 1937, which to me brings it back altogether from what we were just saying. And it's me being contrary. Which, why not? Maybe we could close on this unless the discussion keeps moving forward here. Let me figure out how to get this thing to work. God, it's giving me trouble this time. Okay, here we go. So I forget the name of this piece, but in contrary to the boxes, although it ends up it is a box, it's this little thing, which might be, Sidney in his lecture talks about the fact there were two scenarios. So one was Monsieur Faute, and the other one might be this. Although this is a little bit later, right? But it's so cinematic, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it twists back into his world, because it goes into this little slipcase.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. No. So, I think he was traversing many universes there. All very real to him, but to the rest of us, a mystery, which it should be. I mean, that's the beauty of this guy's work. It's all those words, capricious, enigmatic, whatever, it defines. Maybe in a dictionary someday, his name will be associated with those.
I have to get going, Bruce. Thank you again so much, Robin. This was so delightful.
Incredible. Yes. Oh, we see your note. Thank you for the nice note.
Thank you, Kian. Thank you. Yeah, I'll look forward to being in touch.
Thank you. Let's give her a big round of applause, for our group, and then we'll move into that last set of movies for those who want to see more. Thank you for sharing. It really, wow. And you got your vax too, so
I did. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. Yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, no, I don't know what more to not say or say, but let me find that. I don't know where the code is. Well, the code's in the thing there. Do people still have it, or did it get lost totally? Oh my God, we had a lot of people here. I can't find. There it is, right there. If you don't have it, there's about an hour of things. Some of the stuff we've talked about. Oh, there is one particular film in this hour of films that might interest you all. There's a couple quite rare things, but I forget the name of it. But it shows the plein air business that he talked about, that you mentioned in your paper very clearly, of the early 1907 film. Again, excuse my French. De cheval emballé, the package horse. So it's worth the watch. And if you guys haven't seen the Dancing Sisters, that's worth staying up all night for. But it's right at the beginning, so you won't have to stay up that long. What else is in there that's wild? Well, I'll shut up and just go. Thank you. So we'll jump off to the where's the thing? W2 together, and we'll see you all in the future somewhere, if I can find the right button. Where did it go? It starts with Thimble Theater. Okay. So I hope I can. There we go. Okay. So good night, everyone.
Yeah, good night. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.